Hello all, this is Yolanda Whitty again. I would like to introduce our next two speakers, Beverly Holcombe and Penny Allen. Beverly is a clinical practice specialist with the American Society for Parental and Enteral Nutrition. Prior to joining ASPEN, she was a senior clinical specialist in the pharmacy department at the University of North Carolina Healthcare and clinical professor at the UNC Eshelman School of Pharmacy for more than 25 years. Dr. Holcombe has presented and published extensively on various aspects of parenteral and enteral nutrition therapies, parenteral nutrition safety, and strategies for managing shortages of parenteral nutrition components. Penny Allen is the National Director of Nutrition Support for Optum Infusion Pharmacy. Penny has spent most of the last 30 years in home infusion as a program director, leading teams to provide state-of-the-art care based on ASPEN standards and excellence in home nutrition support. She is a certified nutrition support clinician, serves as chair of the ASPEN Public Policy Committee, and is a published subject matter expert in Medicare parental nutrition policy and other PN-related clinical topics. Her passion is improving access to quality nutrition care for all patients. I welcome them both to begin their presentation.
Good afternoon. This is Beverly Holcombe. I want to thank you for that very kind introduction and let you know that I will start off this presentation and then I will pass it along to my colleague Penny. Thank you very much for your invitation to participate in your Georgia chapter of ASPEN conference. I've had the opportunity to listen to the sessions earlier today, and it's really an exciting conference, and I look forward to the presentations later this afternoon. The title of our presentation is The Effect of Drug Shortages and the Unapproved Drug Initiative on Parental Nutrition Therapy. I'm having a little technical difficulty here. Let's see if we can. My apologies. There we go. I'd like to share with you the disclosures for myself and for Penny. I have nothing to disclose, and Penny is employed by Optum Infusion Pharmacy, and as previously stated, she is chair of the ASPEN Public Policy Committee. The objectives for this afternoon's presentation are to review the current state of parental nutrition component shortages, discuss the consequences of the FDA Unapproved Drugs Initiative, also known as UDI, describe options for managing shortages of parental nutrition components, and lastly, to describe strategies for addressing cost issues associated with the FDA approval of previously unapproved parental nutrition components and ancillary medications. I'd like to start with an update on drug shortages, specifically parental nutrition components. During my presentation, I may use the names of products and pharmaceutical firms. This is necessary to provide factual information about shortages and is not to promote or to provide negative comments about any firm or product. I think managing shortages of parental nutrition components is like the nursery rhyme of Old Mother Hubbard. You feel like you're constantly going to the cupboard and it's always bare. So what do we know about our parental nutrition cupboard? This bar graph shows the number of new shortages of all medications for the calendar year, with the injectables noted in green and non-injectables in the blue bars. You can see that about half of all shortages are sterile injectables, and of those, most are generic products. This includes many parental nutrition components. The reasons for this large number of generic sterile injectable shortages is that there are a limited number of manufacturers and they have limited production capacity for these older products. That's combined with a long lead times and the complexity of manufacturing injectable medications. This results in this group of medications, sterile injectables, being very vulnerable to any glitch along the manufacturing process. If there's any deviation from good manufacturing, inability to get raw components, to the contaminants, whether that be microbial or particulate matter, it very quickly creates a shortage. And because there are a limited number of other manufacturers, it's difficult for a second or even a third company to pick up and increase production. So as you can see from the previous slide that the number of new drug shortages has been decreasing since it peaked out around 2011. This graph is of the active shortages by quarter over the last 5 years. And you can see that for about the last 3 years or so, the number of active shortages is slightly less than 250, or around 250. And so this is not just the new shortages, but all drugs that are in short supply. And again, about 50% of these are sterile injectables. Some of the things that the FDA has reported are that we have more active shortages, which is demonstrated here. The FDA has also evaluated the number of active shortages and determined that we have more persistent shortages, which means that they go on for a longer period of time. And lastly, they're more intense, meaning that the amount of product that's in the market is very, very limited. So we typically may have a shortage when we can only meet about 50% of demand. So this means demand can be down to 5 or 10%. So a really critical shortage. Many of you may have seen this slide before. These are all of the parental nutrition components that have been in short supply over the last decade or so. Every parental nutrition component that we use to provide care for patients has been in shortage at least once. I think the only product that's not on that list is manganese. Interestingly, once a medication or a particular parental nutrition component is in short supply one time, it's very likely that product will be in short supply again and again. Of note, the intravenous multivitamins and the concentrated sodium chloride, or also known as 23.4% sodium chloride, are in the top 5 products for being in short supply the longest time. According to the FDA, both of these products have been in short supply for over 10 years. This is a list of medications that are considered in short supply by the American Society of Health System Pharmacists, or ASHP, and the FDA. The information that's posted by ASHP is provided by the University of Utah Drug Information Service. Both of these sites are available to the public, so you can use this to find out if medications or parental nutrition components are in short supply. I updated this list just a few days ago, and you can see that the medications that are considered in short supply by the University of Utah Drug Information Service are slightly different than those listed by the FDA. There's some commonalities, but there are also some products that are different. And why does this happen? Why are these two sites not the same? And this is actually a complaint of many consumers, prescribers, industry, that these lists should be the same. Well, they're not the same because these two groups can identify and resolve shortages differently. I think the biggest difference comes in the way that they define a shortage. For the University of Utah Drug Information Service, it's a supply issue that affects how pharmacies prepare or dispense a product. or that influences patient care when prescribers must use an alternative therapy. An example of this is if there is a medication X and a 20 milligram tablet is not available, a pharmacy may choose to dispense 2 10 milligram tablets to provide that dose of 20 milligrams. In that situation, UUDIS would consider this drug X in short supply because not all presentations are available. On the other hand, the FDA defines a shortage when the demand or projected demand for the drug exceeds the supply. So in this example of drug X, the FDA would not consider it a shortage because we can use 10 milligram tablets to make that 20 milligram dose. There's some other differences in the way these groups are notified of shortages, their standards for determining shortages, and how they resolve shortages. But again, I think the biggest difference as a clinician is how they define shortages. So what is the role of the FDA in drug shortages? Every time there's a shortage, we contact the manufacturer, and we all want to scream, what can the FDA do about this? Why can't the FDA fix this? So what can the FDA do? The FDA's approach to preventing and mitigating drug shortages is to address underlying cause and enhance product availability. They collaborate with manufacturers to try to minimize the time that we have a shortage. They ultimately want to minimize patient risk, so they work with the manufacturer on quality issues. I think it's really important to note what the FDA cannot do, because that's where we seem to have concerns as clinicians. They cannot require a manufacturer to produce a drug, to increase production of a drug, or change the distribution of a drug. So although they have a lot of authority, there are some things they cannot do, usually the things we really wish that they could do. As an effort to give the FDA more authority to work with manufacturers and to resolve shortages, there have been 2 pieces of legislation that have occurred over the last decade. The first is the Food and Drug Administration Safety Innovation Act, known as FDASIA, which became law in 2012. This was after the critical drug shortages that we began to experience around 2009 to 2011. And for those of you who've been in practice, remember that was really a tough time. FDASIA enhances the FDA's ability to combat shortages and requires manufacturers to notify the FDA about potential shortages or any disruption in the supply chain. It also required the FDA to develop a strategic plan on drug shortages. This gave the FDA a lot of authority and ability to work and resolve shortages or prevent shortages, but it wasn't enough. So in 2020, as part of the Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act, known as the CARE Act, there were some components of that deal with drug shortages. This expanded the FDA's authority, requires manufacturers to provide more details about the shortage or any disruption, and not only to deal with the finished product, but to give information about the active pharmaceutical ingredient or the raw product. So this again expands the FDA's authority to work with manufacturers to try to prevent and mitigate shortages. So what are the consequences of parental nutrition component shortages? Well, I'm going to be very brief about this because this morning during Jessica's presentation, she addressed a lot of the micronutrient deficiencies that occur during shortages, and so I won't repeat that. I'll just highlight a few things. I think back in the mid-'80s, we had a shortage of intravenous multivitamins, and as a result, there were some deaths associated with thiamine deficiency. And this morning, Jessica talked a lot about the refractory acidosis associated with thiamine deficiency and the need to provide thiamine during shortages of intravenous multivitamins. I think she also addressed some of the micronutrient or trace element deficiencies that have been associated with shortages and how they might present. These photos are from a paper published by David Sears and his group about a patient that was on home parental nutrition for a period of time and was discharged with an order to include zinc, including additional zinc in his parental nutrition admixture. There was a shortage and the home infusion company was unable to provide that zinc, and he showed up sometime later with these desquamative lesions that were consistent with zinc deficiency. He was started on oral zinc, and the photos on the right show the resolution of that zinc shortage. Excuse me, that zinc deficiency. This is a little bit old, but it's some results of a survey conducted back in 2014 by the Institute for Safe Medication Practices. And they looked at all parental nutrition components and any reported examples of errors or preventable adverse drug events. And you can see this ran the spectrum from trace elements to fat emulsions to our electrolytes and trace elements. You can, if you can take a look at this later and look at all the different examples that occurred. So as mentioned earlier today, shortages of all parental nutrition components can lead to adverse patient events and suboptimal patient outcomes. But one thing that I think is really important to consider are shortages in the parental use process. We think about the adverse events and the consequences to patients, but it has effects over the entire parental nutrition use process. From procurement, if there's not product available, the institution's purchasing agents have to look around and try to find product, be aware that sometimes products show up in the gray market or in the black market, and of course price goes up. We also have to think about prescribing. It's difficult for prescribers to know what's available, what's not available, and how that might, it creates quite a burden when you're trying to prescribe parental nutrition during a shortage. The order review and verification process is challenging for pharmacists because prescribers may order one thing and you have to substitute or find an alternative therapy. The compounding dispensing process can be challenging, continuing to change products, alternative products, have products with different concentration, and there's a risk of error. Administration, which I think is tough for nurses or caregivers because that are administering parental nutrition, because products or the PN admixture may always be changing. And we have to increase our monitoring of patients, increase monitoring to identify, make sure that deficiencies are not occurring, increased monitoring of all serum chemistries. So it really creates a huge burden over the entire system. And another part of this is the amount of time and labor it requires just for pharmacies and the entire institution to manage shortages, policies, and procedures. Now we have pharmacy personnel that just deal with shortages. And lastly, for those of you who have been involved in contacting a prescriber or a nurse or a patient or a family member to talk to them about shortages, it really creates stress on the entire healthcare professional and healthcare professional to patient relationship, because shortages are it's constantly changing. It's a very stressful environment. So what sort of shortages, what sort of resources are available to clinicians to help manage shortage? And I'd just like to address the ones that are available from ASPEN. I put a number of those here. ASPEN has a whole parental nutrition component shortage website. We include shortage recommendations for all the macronutrients and micronutrients. We offer a number of webinars and other educational programs to assist you in managing shortages. It's also important to know that it's any adverse event, error, related to shortages should be reported to the Institute for Safe Medication Practices. This is done anonymously, and it is information that can be safely provided because they are considered a safe site by AHRQ for collecting patient information. So moving along, some of the strategies for general strategies for managing shortages are to implement conservation early, assess and routinely reassess the indication for parental nutrition, switch to oral or enteral nutrients, reserve those products for patients that need them. Make sure you review the entire portfolio for different concentrations. Purchase only what you need, compound in a single location to try to minimize waste, reach out to others, and increase awareness and assessment for signs and symptoms of deficiencies. So what are some of the current challenges with parental nutrition? I think the multivitamin infusion shortage is certainly one that we're all dealing with. As I said, the vitamin shortage has been going on and off for about 10 years. Most recently, Sandoz via Baxter has provided a letter saying that there will be a continued shortage into the fall. Hospira or Pfizer does not expect to have their MVI product back into the market until March of next year. So some of the management resources are the ASPEN shortage recommendation, the various webinars that ASPEN has presented, and contacting Baxter customer service regarding the Infuvite products. And I think perhaps next spring we'll have the Hospira or Pfizer product available. This is what I call sort of just a semi-shortage, with American Regent eliminating some of their trace element products, particularly the multi-trace element product for pediatric patients. There's been a sense that there's a shortage of this. I think we're in a transition period until they come out with their new trace element product for patients less than 10 kilograms, which is expected this fall. So we may have what is a sense of shortage just because the manufacturer is discontinuing some of these products. There's currently some challenges with lipid injectable emulsions. Baxter recently released a letter about a supply disruption. I think many of you may have received that. Fresenius Kabi's site says that there's some back order, and they do expect to release product around the end of this month. And at this time, I'm not aware of any supply issues with B-Braun. I think they do tend to restrict their product to their customers. We're having some issues with some electrolytes right now. There's a supply issue with sodium phosphate, which means they'll probably trickle into the potassium phosphate market. There's continues to be some challenges with getting an adequate amount of sodium acetate, and of course this trickles into the availability of potassium acetate. So sometimes a shortage of one product will increase demand for another and cause a shortage. Another type of shortage I call the fake shortage, which Penny may talk about a little bit more. It's when a manufacturer comes back into the market or has a significant price increase, and in turn institutions may choose to take that product off of their formulary, or they're going to carry a very small amount of that product. So clinicians are hearing about an announcement that there is a shortage when in turn an institution may choose not to carry the product, not because there's a shortage, but because they made a business decision to for revenue or for cost savings, and so the product's not available within the institution. Because I'm running a little bit out of time here, what are some of the best practices when shortages resolve? So what do you do when your cupboard is full, or how do you know when your cupboard's full? Pharmacies or home care agencies can get adequate product through the normal supply chain. They can get enough to get full daily doses. FDA and UDIS will consider the shortage resolved, and you can find that on their websites under resolved shortages. When it's resolved, you should resume normal dosing. The lack of observed adverse events or deficiencies associated with partial dosing is not a reason to continue that rationing once the shortage has resolved. You need to communicate with prescribers and clinicians, also patients and consumers, that the shortage has resolved. And so they know to ask for a full daily dose of the component. ASPEN offers a site for appropriate dosing of parental nutrition components. This is available on the shortage site, as well as several other places under parental nutrition resources, so you know what appropriate dosing is. So in summary, shortages of parental nutrition components continue. Dealing with these shortages has become part of the norm. Shortages can result in adverse events and suboptimal patient outcomes. ASPEN offers lots of resources to aid clinicians in managing shortages. Persistent shortages have led to a tendency to provide less than adequate dosing, which can lead to deficiencies and impair growth and healing. And lastly, when a shortage resolves, clinicians should resume normal, usual daily dosing. Do not continue to ration as a cost savings measure. These are my references and resources for this presentation. And I will turn the screen over to my colleague, Penny Allen.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's Penny Allen. Oh my goodness, I have an echo. Let me unplug my headphones. Let me see if my slide presentation is in the correct mode. How was that? Is that good? Can someone confirm that you can see my screen?
Hi, Penny. Would you adjust your display settings so that you're in presenter view?
Hold on one second. Better?
Perfect. Yes.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Well, good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to buzz through the first couple of slides because Bev went over the disclosures for us. The only thing I do want to reiterate is, in interest of the topic that we're covering today, it is necessary to speak to brand names and company names purely for factual information as we continue to discuss shortages and things that affect PN therapy. All right, so one thing that really truly in the last 3 or 4 years has impacted the provision of PN ingredients, compounding the shortage situations, is the Unapproved Drug Initiative. Bev mentioned it briefly. This is a program that was launched by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, or the FDA back in June 2006. And the goal was to remove any unapproved generic drugs that were on the market. And these were, usually some really old drugs that have been around prior to the FDA approval process, to make sure that safety standards were in place, that they met the, all of the safety requirements out there, that now when a new drug goes through the Food and Drug Administration approval process, that everything is at a level set. In April 2010, this really got going. One of the first drugs that went through this process was colchicine for gout. And one of the, what they call the unintended consequences of this, and some of the controversy that has arisen over the last couple of years, is due to the rebranding of the drug. When a manufacturer has a drug and they're required to go through the FDA approval process, the cost can be pretty high, like literally in millions of dollars, to get a new drug application, to go through the process, to conduct any research that might be required. So what ends up happening is the old generic drug goes through the process, gets re-released, rebranded, and the unintended consequence is the price of the medication goes up exponentially after rebranding. So what's been happening over the last year or so is last November, HHS published the first notice in the Federal Register saying it was terminating the UDI. Come to find out after the fact, there was some kind of snafu, because in May of this year, 2021, this report was withdrawn and the UDI is now back in place. So this just is a blurb from the New England Journal of Medicine about 10, 11 years ago, basically that, they're arguing that, is there meaningful improvement to public health if you're taking a drug that we've been using for years and years? And when I go through some of the examples that, are impacted in the PN world, you'll see, does it really make a difference or not? Obviously, we're all inclined to vouch for safety and making sure our drug supply is safe in the United States. But, medical professionals, have argued that something like the colchicine, the price per pill, after going through a rebranding process, went from 9 cents a pill to almost $5 a pill, so an exponential increase. So how has this affected the provision of PN therapy? As Bev said, many of the ingredients we use in PN are generic injectables. So many, if not all, of the electrolytes and so forth that we utilize for parental nutrition were on the 2006 unapproved drug list, meaning that they had a window of time before the FDA came into the manufacturer and said, you either have to stop manufacturing this product or you've got to put it through the new drug application process and go through all of that and release it as a new branded product. So some of the items, and we'll talk through these in a little bit of detail, that have been impacted in the last 2 years or so are Lcysteine, Selenium, Zinc sulfate, multitrace element combinations, both adult and PD that Bev just mentioned, dehydrated alcohol, which is really not a PN ingredient, but an adjunctive therapy that was utilized with ethanol locks for catheter lock therapy to prevent bloodstream infections, potassium phosphates, and most recently ascorbic acid. So the first one, and again, brand names, we all know that within the last year, this ties in with some of the presentations you heard this morning. What was the rationale for the demand and the ask for a new multitrace element formulation, going back well over 10 years ago or more. So the new product was formally launched in 2020, meaning that the generic multitrace element products are no longer available. They are not allowed to be manufactured, so you will not see any more, unless there's a little stash hanging out somewhere in a pharmacy, of MTE5. Not Peditrace, that's an error, excuse me. It's the multitrace element 4 for pediatrics. So those are either phased out completely or in the process of being phased out. So the Trailament product, which is utilized for patients above 10 kilos, it can be used with children that weigh more than 10 kilos or 22 pounds. And the new pediatric version was launched this week, and that's the next slide. I'm not going to say it correctly, Multitrace. The formulation is different. You heard this from Jessica this morning than the previous generic formulations because of the research associated with contaminants, chromium, manganese, et cetera, et cetera. So I think you got the message earlier that there's really no reason to try to supplement to match the old formulation. There's a reason why the old formulation went away. Not stating that any formulation is perfect and that will meet every patient's needs, but definitely the chromium and manganese changes were purposeful. One of the other things that came out of the rebranding of Trailament was the increase in price compared to what generic multitrace element formulations cost. I think before they went out, and this was a high price back then, it was about $2 for a 1 ml dose. Years prior, it was much, much less than that. Currently, for the home infusion market right now, the cost is $17 for 1 ml, which is the standard dose for adults. Multitrace, I had to see it to be able to pronounce it correctly. You probably all got the email this week. There was an announcement that this new pediatric version of a multitrace element. It's a newly branded product, FDA approved, not launched, not released, not available at this moment, but coming this fall, as Bev said. This will be indicated for neonates and children under 10 kilograms. This will replace the Multitrace 4 pediatric product, which is being phased out. Again, not a true shortage, but definitely, you know, hopefully we won't run out before Multitrace is released into the market. One of the differences with this product is it does contain a small amount of selenium. And if you recall, the Multitrace 4 did not contain selenium, so you had to always add selenium as an extra into the PN bag. The price right now, to my knowledge, is not yet known. We'll see, you know, what that is when it comes out, but this is basically what it contains: 1,000 micrograms of zinc, 6 micrograms of selenium, 60 micrograms of copper, 3 micrograms of manganese, all in 1 ml, and its dosing is weight-based. So the dosing starts at 0.2 of an ml based on the baby's weight. So more to come on that. One of the other products that went through the rebranding UDI process was IV Selenium. This was launched in 2019, so we're going on a little over 2 years now. And probably the biggest impact, you know, they rebranded, they changed the formulation of the selenium a bit. The technical or the formal name is selenium acid for injection, USP. The price went up significantly, which this is one of the products that I've seen across the country, looking at scripts like Jessica mentioned this morning from all over the country and seeing what practice patterns are. There are some hospitals that were not using the new selenium for a time. There were home care companies that were trying not to use the new selenium, trying to provide oral selenium for all. And those are, you know, some of the unintended consequences when it comes to patient care and assuring that patients' microtrace element needs are met. The price went from about $450 for a flat of 25 vials to almost $9,000 when the new selenium first came out. Now, thankfully, that's lowered a bit, but ballpark in the home care world, it costs a company $20 for a standard adult 60 microgram dose. So that's significant. And just to put that into context, you know, when you work in a hospital, sometimes you don't see what the charges are on the patient's bill or the charges that go to the insurance company for a hospitalized patient. In the home infusion world, this greatly affects patients and consumers as well as the providers, because we're dependent on the pricing that is basically dictated to us. So there are many contracts in the home care world where we may get paid $100, $120 a day, flat rate for PN. So if $20 of that $100 or $120 or even $130 rate is just the selenium, that's significant. So the concentration did change when we had the generic selenium product that was 40 micrograms per ml. Now it's 60, which I think is positive. But most adult patients will receive what they need for selenium from their Multitrace combination, which is now Trailament, which has 60 mics as well. When patients do need more selenium, again, that's priced out as a separate item, but not necessarily reimbursed by the payers. So the generic pediatric and neonatal trace element preparations, as we said, were being phased out. None of them contained selenium. So if you're still using that, if you work in the pediatric world, you're still having to add selenium separately to the bag until the Multitrace comes out. And that's where I've seen, we've had in the home care world, you know, neonatal infant patients referred to us for home PN and they had no selenium in the bag, and the child had been on PN for a couple of months with no selenium whatsoever because of cost containment issues. Zinc sulfate also went through this process, a new branded IV zinc. This was also launched shortly after selenium in 2019. So again, none of the former generic zinc formulations are manufactured. Stability data is available. This was a big thing with selenium and zinc when they first got launched. The company initially, I mean, they basically said right out, we didn't think about home care. You know, everyone is accustomed to thinking about the hospitalized setting, where if you're compounding a bag of PN in the hospital, you're putting everything in the bag, you're sending it up to the floor. In the home care world, you know, I think it was stated earlier today too, we're making 7, maybe 8 bags at a time for a patient. So we need that longer term stability, because otherwise, you know, the solution is not stable, or like multivitamins have to be added daily by the patient or caregiver, because in the home setting, the stability is not there beyond 24 hours. So American Region went back, which was great, and did the stability data for zinc and selenium. So now we have that extended beyond use dating, so that we can put the zinc and the selenium in the bag in the pharmacy, you know, which helps to minimize patient ads in the home setting, which the more patient ads you have, the more you have the potential for error and complications. So we're always trying to minimize how much that patient and family has to do with the bag, and determine, do they really need this or not? You know, is the zinc that they're getting in the Trailament adequate to meet their needs? If no, then okay, you know, we can put the zinc in the bag now that we've got the stability data. But minimization of patient ads whenever possible, as long as it's clinically appropriate, is important in the home setting. So the other changes were that there are now 3 strengths of zinc sulfate. There's a 3 milligram per ml, a 1 milligram per ml, and a 5 milligram per ml. There was some concern initially with the advisory board that would this be too confusing when we look at in the pharmacy setting to have multiple strengths available, or is it a benefit, you know, so that the pharmacy has the flexibility to utilize what makes sense for their PN census. The cost for the average 5 milligram per ml went up considerably. So right now we're looking in the home care world, I can't speak to the hospital pricing, but we're looking at $1,100 ballpark for a flat of 25 vials. Which comes out to be about $45 a vial, or $4.50 for an average dose. Again, but that's only if you're utilizing the full vial. When Bev spoke about compounding, I mean, whether you're in the hospital setting or a home infusion pharmacy setting, that's what you're trying to do, is make sure, how many patients do I have that get individualized zinc, and I need to compound them all on the same day, because if I'm using a $45 vial for just one patient, then the price of the dose is $45. Oblistinol is the branded name for dehydrated alcohol. Formerly, this was just a generic product. You know, we've been using this in the home infusion world for decades for select patients who have repeat bloodstream infections. For many patients, it worked really, really well. It literally used to cost pennies per day. So home infusion companies provided this. It wasn't a big deal. We were never reimbursed for it, but the cost was minimal, and it made good sense, and really for many patients had great outcomes in terms of prevention of catheter-related bloodstream infections. So until early 2020, there were still 3 generic manufacturers producing this. And over time, the FDA went to those manufacturers and said, you have to rebrand or not. And a couple of them opted out and said, no, thanks, we're not doing this. So today there is only one FDA approved product out there, and there is no other equivalent product if you want to use ethanol for catheter lock. There's recommendations from the CDC to consider antibiotic locks for those patients that are high risk. There's been a flurry of communications, discussions, prescribing recommendations, and not even recommendations, but in the home infusion world, questions of whether we can do this. Can we do sodium citrate? Can we do concentrated sodium chloride? Like all kinds of things, you know, with it's not the exit of dehydrated alcohol from the market, but this is definitely one of those where it's not a shortage, it's just that the price went up exponentially. So right now, when we're looking at a flat of 10 vials, and the vials are only 5 mLs, it's about $8,000 for most home care companies. So the initial price was close to $10,000 when it first came out. The dehydrated alcohol, or the oblistinol, is not indicated for use in catheters. It's indicated for, I can't ever remember, some cardiac type of indication, but net is for the home care world, this has been very difficult for long-term PN patients, particularly on the pediatric or intestinal failure side, you know, for both adults and peds, but that's where we're at with Ablissinol right now. Lcys is the newly branded IV Lcysteine. This was launched in May 2019. 2019 was a big year for PN ingredients to go through this process. So as we all know, if you've worked in pediatrics, Lcysteine is not added for nutritional purposes per se to neonatal PN scripts. It's added to enhance the solubility of the PN formulation, understanding that, you know, usually those scripts have more calcium, more phosphorus, more, you know, potential to precipitate out. So 10 mLs now has 500 milligrams of cysteine hydrochloride, single dose 10 ml vial, 10 vials per carton is $725. One of the biggest challenge besides the cost for the new branded Lcysteine is that there is no stability data beyond 24 hours. So if we're using a product like this in hospital and you can put the Lcysteine in the bag because you're making one bag at a time, then it's fine. It continues to serve the same purpose it always has. But if you're talking about compounding 7 days for the home setting and shipping that out to a patient, and the product doesn't have stability beyond 24 hours, it wouldn't make sense to use it in home care. So that has been a challenge. 7 Ascor is the newly branded Ascorbic Acid, which was just launched this year by McGuff Pharmaceuticals. The cost currently for home care is $237 ballpark. You know, many of us are on the same buying contracts, so we have pretty much the same ballpark pricing, and that would be for one 25-gram vial. So that's not a mistake, 25-gram vial. The FDA indication for this product is for the short-term treatment of scurvy, and the dose is 200 milligrams a day. So think about how many patients, you know, you would be using that full vial for. Otherwise, you're wasting a portion of it if you don't utilize it. And as I'm saying, doubtful that any home care provider would use a full vial, even if they had a very large census of PN patients, because today, you know, in the 70s and 80s, in home care, everybody got 500 milligrams of ascorbic acid every single day. That practice has kind of, you know, fell off the wayside, and now we take a look and examine what makes sense. What does the patient actually need? You know, those across the board types of recommendations shouldn't be in place anymore. It's individualization and looking at what do patients need. So the challenge would be, you know, a 25-gram vial. So MVI, Invuvite, when we have it, which unfortunately, as Bev said, that's like a pendulum that just keeps swinging back and forth. But MVI or Invuvite contains 250 milligrams of ascorbic acid, and thankfully that meets the needs for most adult stable PN patients. So after looking at this, and this is just a smattering, I'm sure there's more ingredients that are going to go through this process. It's going to impact the rising cost of being able to provide and produce home PN and hospital PN. So what does that mean? What are the considerations for us as clinicians, as prescribers? And you know, this goes hand in hand with what the ASPEN recommendations are. We need to assess the dosing of all the PN ingredients for each patient based on their individual needs and ask the question, first and foremost, is the indication for PN there? Does this patient really truly need parental nutrition? You know, or are they a good candidate for enteral? Or is it time to wean them? Perhaps they've been on PN and it's really time to wean. The patient is getting better, whatever their condition is, you know, is improving, and it's time to start weaning them off the PN. And then that week to week or whatever the lab schedule is, assessing exactly what that patient needs. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, avoid across the board dosing recommendations based on like, this is what we do in this institution, or this is what everyone gets. I remember fondly a talk that Dr. Dudrick gave years ago. I can't even remember which ASPEN meeting. And he brought this point up, and he had an acronym that was funny. And it was something to the effect of, because we've always done it that way. Like, and he called it WADIBDA. And he gave a couple of funny examples, like, why are you doing that? Would-did-da. We've always done it that way. So if there's no clinical basis or justification, in my 30 years plus of home infusion experience, I can recall accounts where everybody got an extra 30 of copper, believe it or not, or everybody got an extra 10 of zinc, or everybody got 200 micrograms of selenium, just because. Like, we can't do that anymore. In the last 10 years, when you look at the morbidity and mortality, the studies that Jessica and Bev mentioned, there has to be a clinical indication for that dosing. It has to make sense from a clinical perspective, but also thinking about if we're living in rationing times, which we are again. I just put out a field alert to our company clinicians yesterday, because now all of a sudden it's not just lipid and Infuvite, now it's phosphates again, and we're living in this continuous swing where you have to preserve what you have to dose appropriately and not just give extra just because. So in this, we've already spoken to this earlier today. There's no clinical need or requirement for IV manganese for the most part. So, in the beginning, when Trailament came out, we got referrals from a nutrition support physician who, not calling him out, but he just may not have realized that he didn't need to supplement everything that used to be in the old MTE. And he was for a while, until we educated and said, hey, you know what, this new formulation is better, and so on and so forth. And for right now, unfortunately, until there are stability studies for Lcysteine, I don't, if someone can point it out, if they think that it should be prescribed in the home setting, but it doesn't make sense to me if it's not going to be stable beyond 24 hours. The OLE Foundation and all of the education that we do with consumers and so forth is also recommending that patients be more aware of what is going on regarding shortages, regarding the UDI. That way, if you're on PN for any length of time, or your child, your family member is, this is something that they need to be aware of as well. They need to be able to be their own advocate and ask questions. Is something eliminated from my script? Learning to look at your label and say, I don't have selenium anymore. I used to get it. How come I don't have calcium in my script right now? Being able to ask those kinds of questions and say, how come I'm getting my lipid is being rationed now? So that way we're all on the same team. We're all on the same page. So that open dialogue, providing education, are the newer formulations of my products stable in my HPN, and so on and so forth. So know that that type of education and coaching is going on within the PN consumer community as well. So what's our call for action? Home PN providers need to join efforts. Like, I can't emphasize enough. I think I did a talk, and this might have been my talk last year. It's like, get involved. Get involved, even if it's a simple thing like, kudos to going to the governor of Georgia and declaring, that October 4th through the 8th is Malnutrition Awareness Week. It doesn't take much to do something like that. I just did it for my state a couple of days ago. It was a quick and easy link. You might think, I don't know anything about lobbying. I don't know anything about public policy or whatever, but honestly, it's small stuff. Even just being aware and making yourself, read, get educated, understand if there's a new product out there, read up on it. Maybe your hospital is saying, no, we're never going to have that on formulary. But when your patient leaves the hospital, they may go to a company that doesn't have to go through a cumbersome process to put something new on formulary. And one of us may call you and say, hey, there's this new product. We think it has clinical benefit, and it may be more cost effective. Are you open to utilizing that? So being aware, being educated, but also getting involved in any advocacy efforts, whether it's regarding products, drug shortages, et cetera. It takes all of us to speak up, to get involved. And if we're at the point where it's going to end up, with the government that we can't afford to make a bag of PN to ship to patients, then we're going to be on really shaking ground. And that's not what any of us want to see. So that's my soapbox. So learning assessments, I think I might be over time, but if you, take a look at these questions, I could buzz through them really quick. But the goal of the Unapproved Drug Initiative was, correct answer is C, reduce the number of drugs in the US marketplace that lacked FDA approval. That's the #1 initiative for the Food and Drug Association. Learn which national drug shortage database includes a PN component when there is a change. in supply that affects how a pharmacy prepares or dispenses a product, or requires use of an alternative PN component, which may affect patient care. If you remember, Bev said it's the American Society of Health System Pharmacists. And 3, when a shortage of a PN component resolves, what action should be implemented by your institution? The correct answer is B, resume full or usual dosing. I cannot tell you how many prescriptions in the last 20 years or so that I see that come through from all around where when shortages have long resolved, things are still eliminated from a PN order form. Something is still being given twice a week or 3 times a week, and there's plenty of supply in the marketplace. So we need to always remember to go back to where you were. If you changed your PN order form in your institution, then change it back once that shortage has resolved. Even though, unfortunately, in another year or 2 or a couple of months, we may be back in a shortage situation, but giving full daily dosing is imperative when the supply is available. And that is it.
Wonderful. Thank you, Penny. This is Laura Kosla. I am the Regional Nutrition Manager for Optum Infusion and also the ASPEN Secretary Treasurer, and I'll be moderating the questions. And we've had one come over, and it's actually a combined question here. So for Bev and Penny, so it says, can you please address the FDA practice of granting exclusivity for years to manufacturers who are first in market for approving a previously unapproved product? There is no ability for competitor products to come on the market to drive prices down and mitigate shortages. Is ASPEN working with the FDA to change that?
Bev, do you want to take this? This sounds like it's right up your alley.
I'll be happy to start that. First, I think the reason manufacturers ask for exclusivity is that they have, it's cost them a lot of money to get a product rebranded, such as the dehydrated alcohol that Penny mentioned, the Selenium, the Lcysteine. So by having exclusivity, that they are able to recoup those costs. I think exclusivity is sometimes used to encourage manufacturers to enter the market for a sterile injectable, knowing that it is costly and it does allow them to recoup their expenses for bringing a product or a rebranded product to market. ASPEN has had several discussions with the FDA about this, including describing to them some of the adverse patient events or suboptimal outcomes associated with items like the alcohol. They have been very receptive to our comments and concerns, and but they are not going to reverse that exclusivity. Sadly, we just sort of have to wait it out. But ASPEN has been very active, and I think Penny's been a part of those discussions that we've had with the FDA about that.
Yes, the most recent discussion we had was back in November, and there was a committee of us that met with the FDA, and what we were presenting was the risk and the concern that, you know, this would affect patient access to care. You know, indirectly, this would impact patient outcomes. And unfortunately, at that time, they were receptive, but anything related to cost issue, they don't want to touch, and they don't want to get involved in pricing, exclusivity, and so on and so forth. So I think the biggest conundrum has been with the oblissanol, the alcohol. That's, you know, as we continue to hear of patients having more line infections than what they had in the past. You know, with that, I don't really know what the answer is. I think we've all tried to come up with solutions or thoughts like, how do we attack that, particularly with the alcohol more than anything else. So our hands, as Deb said, our hands have been tied, and it hasn't been from lack of trying and lack of bringing, you know, groups together for discussion and bringing our concerns to the government agencies.
That's sort of a curious thing about the alcohol is that the current manufacturer didn't present any new exciting clinical studies. They just went to the old literature for using the alcohol. It's for a cardiac ablation procedure for patients who can't have any other, like a surgical procedure. So they brought this back to market on old information, nothing new, and they were giving that, and actually brought it in as an orphan drug. It's considered orphan, so they were able to get that 7-year exclusivity. I've heard of some clinicians in the home care arena that have been working with compounding facilities, sterile compounding facilities, to make alcohol, which I understand is a pretty a tenuous process, but I think ASPEN has done what we can at this point regarding the exclusivity and the price increase of these, as Penny calls it, rebranded medications.
Yeah, and I'll just comment on that. You know, the compounding pharmacies that are manufacturing the alcohol, that's against the FDA rules because that's illegal. You're not supposed to do that if there is a branded product on the market. So that's I mean, we've had discussions with CAPS, we've had discussions even within some of the proprietary infusion companies. Well, geez, could we do that? But it's not legal. It goes against, so smaller companies may fly under the radar. So there's a whole host of things going on. We're looking at some products outside of the US, talking to the FDA about how can we get those products through the approval process faster, so that we have options. It's like PN ingredients, right? So that we have options that the rest of the world has, but we don't have in the United States. So it's a multi-pronged effort, and we're not giving up. We're continuing to press forward and go down any road that we can.
Thank you both so much for this great presentations and very informative. And that's all of our questions. So thank you both again, and I will pass it over to Adina to introduce our next speaker.